In the previous video, we deployed two firewalls, just quickly configured active passive on the appliances, and we take a look that secondary firewall does not have any licenses. So when you do the lab, you do not have a purchased VM flex credits or VM appliance licenses, so you will not be able to do activate any licenses, because the VM you implement using GitHub code, that basically implement based on BYOL, bring your own licenses. So you won't be able to use your pay-as-you-go licenses on this appliance, right? So what I had to quickly do is I had to use another way to deploy my secondary firewall, right, on a separate way to do that. So basically what I did is I deployed the same firewall in a separate resource group and moved into the same resource group after the deployment. You can you can do so as well. It's the same thing, right? And on my way to redeploying these things, I quickly fix a couple of names which we misspelled last time while creating the interfaces, right? So if you saw, this seems pretty clear that we have a Palo VM 001, Palo VM 002 respected disks, and all of those old NIC cards are still there, which I can delete anytime, right? So all of these NIC cards we're going to use Trust 01, Trust 02, Untrust 01, Untrust 02, and HA01 and HA02 for each firewall, right? So another goal is to bring the firewalls on a same PAN OS, right, to form an HA. As of today's date, September 25, I recently updated one of the other customers' environment, and we went to 10.1.2, but there was a couple of bugs we continuously hitting, so I had to bring it down to 10.0.6 to stable preferred release. And then after we were able to form an HA correctly and also connect to the panorama over site-to-site tunnel where the panorama was on site. So just keep in mind, if you are deploying a new environment, try to use preferred release from a Palo Alto documentation. Do not go for a latest operating system, and that's going to always create a different nuances in your way, and it will be difficult to solve those problems. So just go with the operating system you are comfortable with, right? And those are the things just keep in mind, right? Okay, so next step, as a part 2 video, what we're going to do is I'm going to demonstrate all the configuration you need to do on Azure side on all the interfaces, which will include statically configure all the IP addresses on each interfaces. Make sure that you do not completely rely on DHCP, so next time when you reboot the firewall, it always gonna stick to the same IP address, right? So for that, we gonna go to our documentation. As I mentioned earlier, you have to plan what interfaces you're gonna use where. So on our last notes, if you remember, I am gonna do .4 for each of the respected subnets. I'm going to do .4 on firewall 1, .5 on a firewall 2, and .6 as the VIP if needed, right? So I'm going to explain that later on when we select the interfaces and IP addresses. So .4, if let's say it's a 10.0.0.4, which is going to be management for firewall 1, and if that's a firewall 2, it's going to be 10.0.0.5, right? All right, so let's start with the management interface for 01. All right, let's go to IP configuration. If you see here, it is specifically saying dynamic, right? Let's configure as static, right, and make sure we apply 04 on this specific. It says that the virtual machine associated with this network interface will be restarted to utilize the new private IP address. So if you do the static IP, you would have to reboot the VM, but we know that our VMs are shut down right now, so it's not going to cause any issues. So right now it says that Palo VM 001 ETH0 in resource group is occupying this IP. So this is a great example. This is main reason I did not deleted my old NIC cards on a part 2, just to show this error. So every time you create something new and your IP addresses are attached to older NIC cards, then you definitely go and delete it to use those IP addresses again. So let's go back, go to network interfaces, and we will have to delete this to be able to use those .4 and .5 IP addresses. If you see here, it has occupied .4 IP addresses and .5 IP addresses. All right, so these does not provide an option, so you can quickly go in a resource group, and from there also you can delete these NIC cards which are not necessary anymore in our deployment, right? So six of them selected, delete, hit yes, enter. All right, so all the network cards are removed, and let's go back and do the static IP address assignment, right? So firewall management 1, go to IP configuration. This says dynamic, so if the firewall reboots, you never know is it gonna use specifically this IP or different one IP. We're gonna make sure that we're gonna specifically select the IP address what we want on the each NIC card, right? So we're gonna do that 10.0.0.04, which is on management, save, right, statically, right. After that's done, we can assign Palo VM 001, go back to, let's do management port 2, for this is for firewall 2. So if you remember, we do .5 on the secondary firewall, right? Static 05, as simple as that. Save and done. All right, let's do trust 01 IP network configuration. Static 2.4, that's the firewall 1. So if you notice that it's automatic gives you IP address of 10.0.12 or 3, whatever is your subnet, and then you just change the last octet to make sure that you select the right IP as per your need. So let's do that, this one as well, 2.5, that's the secondary IP. Save. All right, do the same thing for untrust. Yeah, if you already get the idea, you can skip the video part of this, me doing the same thing over and over for all the interfaces. Save. Untrust, this is for untrust interface firewall 2. Change the static IP to 1.5. Okay, 1.5 is used somewhere. Right, so we have to change that first on trust 01 IP configuration. This one's supposed to be 4 because that's a firewall 1. Okay. Yeah, I hope it would let you make a multiple changes, but in this case it doesn't. So you have to be patient with that. Do not to lose your changes. All right, go back on trust 02 IP configuration, static 1.5, save. Okay, that's done. Now we only left with HA01 and HA2. IP configuration, dynamic right now. Make it static here. This one is already the 3.4, which is correct. Yeah, I also tried some time creating duplicate tabs of this same Azure portal and try to make changes on multiple things at the same time. But usually it doesn't turn out good. So if you are doing this, you rather focus on implementation and make sure you selecting everything correctly and have a little bit of patience. All right, so that's done. So we selected all the interfaces. All right, so that's done. All right, so next step for configuring the HA is to have a virtual IP address, as we mentioned earlier, for a trust and untrust IP addresses. Palo Alto also recommend to enable IP forwarding for uh, network interfaces called data plane interfaces for the firewall. So basically that's going to be trust interface of each of the firewall, right? So VIP always goes to one firewall on a Azure side. It cannot be applied to the both the firewall at the same time. So when the VIP is applied to one of the firewall, it becomes active. We have to assign a state active, and when the HA triggers, the Azure firewall do the API calls, and Azure moves dynamically that floating IP to the secondary firewall, right? So let's take a look how we're going to assign the secondary IP to the trust interface. So let's start with that. As we discussed, we're going to use .6 as the VIP address. So this is the one trust IP address. This is default we configured earlier with the static IP. So one quick thing you have to do, enable the IP forwarding, right? Click save, wait for that to apply the change, and then we're gonna quickly add configuration here. Visually I assign as a trust VIP, right, virtual IP address. It says primary IP configuration already exists, which we configure, so we don't worry about it. And static IP we want as 10.0.2.6. that's what we need to use for virtual IP for trust. We will do the same thing with the untrust IP address, right? Same thing with IP forwarding and virtual IP address. So let's go to firewall 01 on trust. Let's take a look at IP configuration, enable IP forwarding, click hit save, right? Right. Let's add the secondary IP address. We're gonna call it untrust virtual IP. That's not gonna be like a 1 and 2 IP address, 1 and 2 IP address. It's just gonna be just one between two so we're not gonna put number 0 and 1 and 2. So we want a private IP address assignment as a static 10.0.1.6. all right, so this is the new part, right? This is the untrust interface, so we want a public IP associated with that as well, and we gonna create a new public IP with the, as you remember, we are following the SKU with the standard, right? And we gonna call it FWPIP, right? So that's gonna be untrust interface public IP. We can also call FW untrust PIP and FW MGMT PIP. That's what we use for public IP on a management interface. So this is good enough. Hit OK, and it's going to create a new when we create this whole configuration. Also, just keep in mind, always assign or associate the public IP to your floating IP. Never put your public IP on your static IP, which is going to stick to that specific firewall. All right, so everything looks good, and quickly hit OK. So it's going to assign that IP address, and let's wait for that to finish. All right, just to quickly summarize what we did so far is we did every changes on NIC cards, which includes a static IP address assignment on each of the NIC cards, also adding a public IP on an untrust interface, enabling IP forwarding on data plane interface being a trust and untrust NIC cards, and assign floating IP addresses on a firewall 1 only, right? So if you remember, we just enable IP forwarding on a firewall 1, so we're gonna do that quickly for trust and untrust interfaces on firewall 2 as well. So go to IP configuration on that NIC card, enable this, and save. This is really important for virtual firewalls to function properly, to forward the traffic and do all kind of inspection it needs in a background. So that's done. Let's go quick back, and firewall trust, we're looking for firewall trust 02. That's required, that the same change, and enable it. Right, save. All right, so that's pretty much it on the Azure side. You got a public IP, you got a virtual IP addresses, and you have configured everything static, so that's never gonna change. That's it. And now we will pick it up from the firewall side. Bring up the firewall. Let's quickly go to virtual machine, firewall VM001, right? Start that machine, and VM002. Start that virtual machine. So on my way here, configuring the new deployment as opposed to part 1, I implemented both of them at the newest operating system, and we gonna configure everything on a newest operating system. It installs, it's gonna be probably 10.1.0. we gonna configure HA. We already configured HA last time, I showed that to you guys, but again, now I have a licenses on both of the firewalls, so as soon as we configure the HA as we did last time, it's gonna bring up all the required, all the required parameters to be matched, and it should be able to communicate, right? So I will be back after configuring HA, which is pretty simple enough for you guys to understand. Also, I will make sure it has all the updates required, dynamic updates, application, and everything matches. So I will be back after that. All right, so I am back after configuring small things onto the firewalls. As soon as I activated the licenses, upgraded to 10.1.0, everything came back up. Just to show you how the HA configuration looks like on the newer version. I am gonna quickly show you guys that. Okay, basically enable HA group ID, right? And this is the peer HA. This is gonna be management interface of the peer, right? And device priority as 100 because this is gonna be active appliance. And if we look at the HA communications, HA1 control link is going to be done on the management, which is already reachable, and we're going to use the 3.4 on this firewall without any gateway, right? If you do not put any gateway, it's going to basically same subnet communication. It should be able to talk to the firewall next to it. I will quickly show you on the firewall VM2 as well. If we look at the general configuration, same thing, group 10, active passive, enable config sync. For this guy, the peer is going to be 0.4, device priority 150. You can put anything between 101 and all the way down to your maximum allowed device priority, because this is going to be the secondary appliances. Higher priority means a secondary appliance. And HA communication, same thing, HA1 on management, and this is going to be 3.5 on 255.255.250 without any gateway. Still, if you quickly take a look at, this is the passive appliance, everything is matched, everything is up, HA1, HA2, right? Okay, so now let's say, if you remember, we configure here DHCP on the last part to make sure the interfaces are correct. So now we configure everything very static on Azure side, and this is gonna be static addresses as well. So on the last deployment, I had trust and untrust zones, which is been deleted after I redeploy the firewall. So I'm just gonna do the same thing one more time. So if you remember that we're gonna do that .4 on the primary firewall. So how we're gonna apply on the interfaces are really interesting, that we will apply .4, right, as a primary address, but we're gonna put the subnet as a 32, right? Same thing, 10.0.1.5/32. We will apply the actual value of the net mask side value when we add the VIP, right? So the 6 is VIP, we gonna keep that all the way down. 4 is primary, 5 is secondary IP, and 1.6 is gonna be the VIP address. So that's where we're gonna put /24. Both of the other ones are gonna be /32. All right, same thing, repeat for trust interface. All right, we're gonna make it a layer 3 IPv4. Let's make this configuration here. Virtual router default, we do not have zone, so let's quickly create a trust zone right here and hit OK. So we got a zone, and same way let's do the IP addresses. 10.0.2.4/32, right? 10.0.3.5/32, and sorry, not 3.5, it's going to be 2.5. And the last one, 10.0.2.6. this is the VIP, so we will have to do /24 on this one, right? And hit OK. If you want to do allow a ping and do all of the other configuration using the management profile, you can feel free to do that. So you'll be able to see ping the interfaces and make sure that those interfaces are up and running by getting the response from the ping. But if you do so, then you'll have to create the policy to allow interzone traffic or whatnot. But let's go with that. You only have to configure all of these things on a one firewall, because as you know, these are all the configuration which can be synced over HA connection, so we don't have to repeat these configuration to the secondary firewall. All right, so while we're talking HA, our Next step is to taking a look at a HA configuration, right? So now if we think for on-site firewall, everything is up and running. So if you fail over, the firewall secondary can be active, secondary going to be active, and this is going to be passive, correct? Definitely true, that's going to be happening, but we have a floating IP addresses on a VM1, right? On Azure side, on physical network interfaces, right? Those will not float to the secondary unless these firewalls as a VM have access to call those APIs, right? They're gonna call the APIs, but Azure is gonna say that okay, they do not have access to the API, right? So let's see, without the so much so complicated portion discuss a lot over is a service principal, right? Which where you configure service principal, create a you know create an application and give the access to both of the VMs. Before jumping into that, over here, really important part on the firewall side is the VM series. So this is where all the configuration goes for those HA. But even before that, if you take a look at the plugins, we are using 2.1.0 version, right? And we are using data plane version for 1.0.3, sorry, DLP version for 1.0.3. So if you quickly go to dashboard, it's gonna show you over here as well, VM plugin series, uh, you know, version. So it always needs to say match, right? If it's not matching on the peer, you definitely need to reinstall the VM series by going in the specific menu we just saw, right? So that's the important part. Also try to look for preferred releases from the VM series as well. As the pan OS, Palo Alto has the preferred releases for all of these small plugins as well. So try to go with the preferred release. Do not go for latest one. It's gonna be causing few problems, right? All right, so right now we are going on a we're gonna use the plugin VM series version. Whatever we have installed here is gonna be 2.1.0, right? So without being said, let's jump into the CLI to do the quickly health check and push that interface configuration, right? If you see here, the interfaces are not up, right? Let's say quickly go to CLI, right? Over here, I'm gonna use this my terminal software on a Mac, which is pretty easy to log into appliances. I have a log, created a host by putting my username, ID, and password. You guys can use putty or whatever you guys use to SSH into the firewall, right? So let's take a look here. This is Palo Alto passive VM002, right? Let's go to first VM01, right? Right, add and continue. So it's quickly log me in because I have a saved username and password. So let's look at us. So interfaces all, right? So interface all. So it only shows you 1/3 because you have not pushed the configuration. If we do so ARP, all right, there is no ARP whatsoever. All right, so let's quickly push the configuration and let's see how it looks like. All right, so it's almost done at 99%. All right. So basically, it came up. The push is finished. So let's go back to our CLI and take a look at our interfaces now. So we're gonna quickly run the same commands. So ARP all, still nothing, right? If we do so interfaces all, we see those are configured as 10 gig interfaces and full up, right? So it has a MAC address coming up as well. If you do so ARP all, nothing, right? All right, so let's take a look at the secondary firewall. Let's do so interface all. So if you see here, it's gonna show you power down, right? It's gonna only show you H interfaces up. All right, so this is a quick thing to notice that if you have an active passive setup in Azure, not the passive interface is gonna be up and running all the time. They will be show as a power down always, right? All right, so let's go back to our setup now. So let's run some commands without configuring any service principal and see what happens when we try to fail over to the secondary firewall, right? So for that, we're gonna run few commands here to see the live logs of the HA, which called tail follow yes, mp log. And if you are interested, you can go with all these possibilities here when you are troubleshooting on any of these, but we're gonna look into pen VM specific log. So I'll have to quickly take this one here, pen VM plugin log. That's what we're gonna use, right? So pen underscore VM underscore plugin log, right? Of course it's gonna say plugin dot log, right? So if you see here, right, it says last a few commands about saying failed to get a Azure token and whatnot. All right, so let's run the same, let's get the copy of the same command here. All right, so over here, nothing is happening right now. Let's fail over the firewall and let's see how it goes, right? All right, so we go back to here, and from active firewall device, high availability, operational commands, and suspend the device for the high availability. So if you see here on a Palo 2, nothing is happening right now. This one, nothing is happening. But if you see Palo 2, it's gonna start with sending a tons of log. So now it says Azure VM HA transmission called, but it failed right away, right? With the client ID to get a failed to get Azure access token, failed to get a client ID, and everything is failing right here. So why it is happening right now? Because we haven't configured anything which is required for Azure HA to be functional, right? So if we look at here, we gonna see now how we can configure these VM series plugin. So now it is asking me, if you look at here, it's gonna ask for a client ID, client secret, confirmation client client secret, because it's gonna be same thing, copy paste, tenant ID, subscription ID, and resource group. All right, so let's start with the most easy one, asking for resource group. Let's start it from bottom to top. Resource group is most easy one. It's just you need to see where your resource group is, where your resource group is for those virtual machines we deploy for the Palo Alto firewalls. So let's go to home, go to resource group. We have this guy here, only one resource group. Copy and paste, right? Subscription ID. For subscription ID, you will need to go to subscription, whatever you use for the whole deployment. It will be on the top. Get a subscription ID from here and paste it. All right. To get all of these other ones, you will have to create an app registration, right? So to do app registration, search for Active Directory, Azure Active Directory. So it will give you this Azure Active Directory page of your organization. You might not have access if you are working a large organization. You might have to go to your Azure admin to do these application registration and get you other information. So you can see the tenant ID here already, but let's quickly go to app registration for now. Right, app registration, we're gonna create a new app. We'll call Palo HA app. Right, let's just call it Palo HA. If you are in a multi-tenant environment, your Azure admin should able to guide you through that, but this is for the lab environment, so we're just gonna stick to the single tenant default settings. You do not need any redirection URL. It is a option URI, and you can register the application. After you register the application, you will have to get access to that application, right? But before that, we can quickly get the tenant ID from here to put into our Azure firewall configuration. So that's done. So now we need a client ID, client secret, right? So to do that, we will have to create a new secret, create a new client secret, right? We're gonna call it Palo HA secret. We're just gonna do 6 months as it suggests. Just copy this. Just keep in mind the secret ID is not a tenant ID or not a client ID, right? So paste this one, right? For the client ID, you will go back to overview of this, and it should have the client ID right here. All right, so we get all those things here. Figure, click OK, right? And let's try to validate it, right? So it says authentication test is passed, right? To be able to have this application access to your floating IP management, we will have to give the application access to your subscription level. So let's go to your subscription and add some access for the application. So go to add role assignment. We're gonna do it a contributor role. So in a medium-sized environment or large-size environment, Palo admin, sorry, not Palo admin, Azure admins won't like you doing a contributor role at the subscription level. But in a lot of environment, I saw that if we apply the if we apply the access at a resource group level, you usually have a primary VNet in a separate resource group. So if you are giving access to cross or multiple resource group, it does not work in a failover scenario, right? It does not fail over your IP addresses to the secondary firewall. So basically, we do not have an option other than the contributor role. What you could do is, if you want to tighten up the access, you can go to our primary website where we usually see all the all the guidance from the Palo network, right? Palo, Alto, HA, Azure, right? Active passive. It's gonna go to first link, and you can copy all this and create a JSON file to provide a custom access, create a custom access, and apply that custom access to these application. So we're gonna quickly select this, right? So now we have access the application, save, and there we go. So let's quickly talk about why we need this service principal, why we need a app registration and kind of access to subscription level. So what basically happens here is Palo Alto VM, right? They get access through the application to your Azure environment to detach those IP addresses from a firewall VM1 and take it to the firewall 2 and attach over there in the failover scenario using APIs. So you can see service principal, application registration, and all this access as you would create a service account on a on-site Active Directory environment, right? Usually service accounts is getting used by some of the appliances and some of the application to have a specific kind of search access or read access or write access throughout your domain. So this is exactly the same way you create a service principal, register the application, and give different kind of access to that application. So when the Palo Alto runs the API, it's gonna go to the Azure API saying, okay, I am these application which is we register, right? And Azure will see what kind of access this application has. So it will see, okay, these application has contributor access, right? And it can detach IP and attach IP. So it's gonna be saying here it's gonna be contributor access, and this application can remove IP from firewall 1, attach firewall IP on a secondary firewall, and things like that. All right, so as soon as our test is passed here, let's commit the change. Is successful now, and we want to take a look at which is the active firewall, and let's test out the failover. Right? This is active passive, so firewall 1 is active, firewall 2 is passive. That's perfect. Let's take a look in the Azure environment where we have our floating IP addresses. So right now let's go to firewall trust 01 where we configure everything. So let's make sure there is a floating IP right there. All right, so let's go back. Let's go to untrust firewall. Untrust NIC card, and let's take a look. Okay, so our secondary IP are over here on the both of the 01 NIC, which is reference to this primary firewall, right? So let's take a look, and we're gonna do the live logging on the firewall as well, right? We're gonna basically tail follow log for the plugin, right? All right, and we're gonna do the same thing on the active firewall, right? So let's see which firewall logs when you fail over from firewall 1 to firewall 2, right? So let's see what happened, right? Firewall 1, which is active appliance, we're gonna suspend to fail over this HA functionality, right? Suspend local device for high availability and click OK. Let's quickly do the device functional one more time, and let's take a look over logins, right? So if you see, nothing is happening on Palo Alto 01. Everything is happening on Palo Alto 02. All right, let's see what is happening. It is trying to detach the IP on firewall untrust 01. It shows all of the detailed information, what subscription it is using, where it is trying to access different kind of resources. Right. All right, and it is sending the APIs to Azure. It will keep sending APIs to the Azure until it is successful and come back. So why nothing happening on the firewall 1? Because firewall 1 in a disaster scenario, firewall 1 is not working at all. So all of the API calls, all of the process is going to be handled by firewall 2 when the failover happened. So firewall 2 in this case is the one who's going to be active after the failover. So without being said, all of the processes happen on the firewall which is going to be active in the future after the HA failover, right? So if you see, it was trying to do untrusted detaching. Now it is also sending a detaching to untrust because detaching was successful while we were talking, and it also sending the request for trust interface detaching, right? So let's wait for a few minutes until this stops. And also a lot of people complain about why this takes a lot of time to fail over, but everything is in Azure's court by now because it's doing the API calls continuously every probably half a second, and then it fails over, right? So after it fails over, it sends out the summary of the logs, basically saying it was successfully completed, HS switchover was successfully completed, and it says attach NIC card, total number of successful detach, and attach NIC card is number 2. That's what we have in here. Over here it says it took only 142 seconds, but in real time it takes longer than that. And everything is back to normal. Alright, let's go back to Azure and see what is going on. Firewall 2 supposed to be active, right? It is active right now. And let's take a look at our NIC cards, right? So let's take a look on firewall trust 01. Do we have that? Firewall trust 01, right? And IP configuration. We do not have floating IP address anymore. That's good. That's a good sign. Let's go to firewall untrust 01 and look at the IP address. And we do not have the secondary IP on untrust interface as well. So that's again one more good sign. So both of the IP addresses successfully detached. Let's see if those were attached or not. Firewall trust 02, it is right here. Awesome. Let's do that on firewall untrust 02, and here it is. Awesome. So everything worked out really great, right? So let's now remove the access from a contributor level and see what happens, right? So let's go to subscription and go to our one and only subscription access control. Let's take a look at the roles, role assignments. Over here we have a Palo, right? Select that and remove it. Yes. All right, refresh it. It says really quick that it was done, but let's wait for a few seconds. Okay, and let's take one more peek here. All right, so no more Palo Alto application here. All right, go. Let's do the same thing. Dashboard. This is passive appliance. Let's failover from firewall 2. So failover, okay, and make device functional. And if you remember, now everything's going to be happening on a firewall 1 because that is the active firewall it's going to be, right? Okay, so if you see here, it is trying to send an URL request with all the subscription ID, and you are getting the fail error. Get request fail 403. Whenever you get the error in get request fail 403, that is always a problem with the access you provide to your application. So run that tail follow log on a plugin, VM plugin log. If you see you get a request 403, you immediately know what is wrong with an HA. So basically what's going to happen now is this is going to go on for a while, like 10-15 minutes, right? After it times out, the firewall over here, it's still gonna be like this one is going to be active appliance, right, and this one is going to be passive appliance. But if you look at in a backend on the NIC cards, the firewall 2 will never release its own IP address, and it will never go to firewall 1. So now you are in a very broken stage where from the Azure standpoint the firewall 2 is active, but from your firewall standpoint the firewall 1 is active, right, which you will have a problem having transferring the traffic forward the traffic, because you have a mismatch of the active and passive firewall in the Azure and firewall environment, right? If you go to back to your CLI, it's just gonna keep going for a really long time, right? So let's stop that, right? Let's quickly go back here, and if you want to see live what happened if you allow the access, so let's quickly take a look, right? XSIAM role assignments, quickly add role assignment and contributor access, and put just Palo HA here really quick. And as soon as you hit save, I'm going to quickly go to this terminus here and see what happens. In 1 second you see 403 was gone, and now you have a lot of command for detaching and attaching API calls are started, and the firewall will have a successful failover now. All right, so there you go. You have an active and passive firewall working in Azure environment. Now you can be creative by sending all the traffic to this virtual IP address. We configure from your backend subnets and different kind of virtual machines to this firewall and create policies and those kind of things. I'm not gonna go into those. Those are pretty straightforward, self-explanatory for interfaces and things like that. So if you want to have a more interfaces, of course, do the same process which we did with the HA. You can add more interfaces. Always keep in mind that it's a 0 is a management interface, Ethernet 1 is a first interface, and so on. One quick thing: a lot of people try to get rid of the public IP of the VM in Azure environment, which is not possible, because using that public IP, VM used to call all the Azure API to failover. So if you remove the public IP from management interface, it's gonna basically not working anymore for the failover. Also, if you want to close it down, use the NSG, use a approved IP address list on the interface in the interfaces here, and use those permitted IP list. And also in the Azure firewall, VM does not allow to do static IP address. Quick tip for the day is, when you have a on-site panorama, right, and you are traversing your management interface traffic through the site-to-site tunnel, use MTU 1300. I learned it really hard way, but if you are traversing your management IP address traffic through the site-to-site tunnel, use MTU as 1300, and it will work. It will start working fine to talk to Panorama and accessing the management interface using HTTPS. So that's a really good tip. We found out after a lot of troubleshooting.